For most of human history, knowing the time meant looking up at the sun, at a clock tower, at the bells ringing across a town square. Then we brought time down from the walls, shrunk it, and strapped it to our wrists. But here's the thing most people never think about. Wristwatches do not just tell the time, they tell stories. A watch can mark the day your father succeeded in business. It can carry an engraving from a wife to her husband. It can survive a trek to the top of Mount Everest. The book A Man and His Watch by Matt Hranek is full of these stories, and in this two-part series, we are weaving the best of them into the history of the wristwatch. This is part 1. The story begins in 1810. The watchmaker Abraham Louis Breguet received a commission from Caroline Murat, the Queen of Naples and Napoleon's sister. She wanted a timepiece small enough to wear on the wrist, decorated like a bracelet. It was not particularly accurate, and the face was almost too small to read. But it was, as far as we know, the world's first wristwatch. For decades, wristwatches remained delicate pieces of jewelry for women of high society. In 1868, Patek Philippe crafted a bracelet watch for Countess Koskowitz of Hungary that still sits in the Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva today. Men, meanwhile, would not be caught dead wearing one. The wristwatch was considered far too feminine. It took a war to change that. In the 1880s, British Army officers began strapping pocket watches to their wrists during colonial campaigns. In the heat of battle, you cannot fumble through your pockets. You need both hands free. During the Boer Wars in South Africa, coordinating troop movements became critical. The wristwatch was not a fashion choice. It was a tactical necessity. But the wristwatch still needed a champion. Enter Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian aviation pioneer living in Paris, famous for flying steerable airships over the city's rooftops. While piloting, he needed both hands on the controls. A pocket watch mid-flight was impossible. So in 1904, he asked his friend Louis Cartier to design a watch he could wear on his wrist. Cartier delivered the Santos, one of the first purpose-built men's wristwatches. It was elegant, practical, and revolutionary. Cartier still makes Santos watches to this day. Hranek visited the Cartier archives, one of the most secretive places in the watch world. Cartier sent a car without revealing the address. The archive was inside a former private bank with retina scanners at the entrance. Inside, archivists pulled out legendary timepieces, including a playful Cartier tank from 1929 that once belonged to Fred Astaire. He had given it to his horse racing trainer with an engraving that read, "For Felix from Fred, 29." In 1905, a young German named Hans Wilsdorf arrived in London and set up a small watch business with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. Wilsdorf was convinced the future belonged to wristwatches, not pocket watches. At the time, most people thought he was crazy. Wristwatches were considered unreliable toys, but Wilsdorf had a vision. He contracted the Swiss firm Agler to build small, precise movements specifically designed for the wrist. In 1910, a small movement supplied by Agler received a chronometer certificate in Switzerland, something Hans Wilsdorf later pointed to as proof that wristwatches could be just as precise as pocket watches. But an even more significant milestone came a few years later. In 1914, a wristwatch sold by Wilsdorf's London company received a prestigious Class A chronometer certificate from the Kew Observatory in England, a distinction normally reserved for high-precision marine chronometers. By that time, Wilsdorf had already created a new name for his watches, a name short, memorable, and easy to pronounce in any language. That name was Rolex. The word was invented. Wilsdorf wanted something short, easy to pronounce in any language, and elegant enough to fit on a watch dial. He could not have chosen better. Matt Hranek, the author of A Man and His Watch, inherited a Rolex Oyster perpetual date just from his father. He remembers the day his father first came home wearing it. That Rolex was not just a watch, it was the symbol of his first successful year in business. When his father passed away, Hranek took the watch. He needed his father close. And to this day, every time he looks at that date it connects the two of them across time. Then came the event that changed everything. World War I. The creeping barrage, an artillery tactic where infantry advanced behind a move-in wall of shell fire, required soldiers to synchronize down to the minute. A few seconds too early or too late meant death by friendly fire. Pocket watches were useless. Wristwatches became standard military equipment. By 1917, the British Army was officially issuing wristwatches to soldiers. These were built for war. Luminous dials for the dark, shatterproof glass, sturdy cases for the trenches. They became known as trench watches. Archaeologist Jack Carlson owns a Waltham trench watch from 1914. He studies what he calls the material biography of objects, the idea that every item carries a life story written through damage and use. His Waltham is battered, the glass is scratched, the case is dented. But that is what makes it beautiful. This watch is worn through a world war, and every mark is a chapter of a story we will never fully know. When millions of soldiers returned home after the war, they kept wearing their wristwatches. Almost overnight, the social perception flipped. The wristwatch was no longer feminine. It was the mark of a soldier, a man of action. The 1920s and 1930s became the golden age of innovation. In 1926, Rolex introduced the Oyster, the first waterproof wristwatch. A swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze wore one across the English Channel, and after 10 hours in the water, it was still ticking. Rolex took out a front-page ad in the Daily Mail, and the legend of Rolex durability was born. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh completed the first solo flight across the Atlantic in 33.5 hours. Afterward, he collaborated with Longines to create the hour angle watch, a massive instrument that allowed pilots to calculate their longitude using celestial navigation. That original watch now sits in the Smithsonian, a reminder that for early aviators, a wristwatch could mean the difference between life and death. In 1931, Rolex developed the perpetual rotor, the first self-winding mechanism, using a full 360-degree rotating weight. This became the foundation for virtually every automatic watch that followed. And then, wristwatches went to war again. World War II pushed watchmaking further. Pilots needed watches for extreme altitude. Divers needed them underwater. Military demands produced innovations that defined decades to come: shock-resistant movements, anti-magnetic shielding, rotating bezels. One remarkable wartime story comes from the Tudor archives. In 1952, a batch of Tudor Oyster Prince watches was sent into one of the harshest environments on Earth, the British North Greenland expedition. Around 24 watches were issued to the team, each one worn and tested in the Arctic for nearly 2 years. They performed remarkably well in extreme cold, with the explorers even recording their accuracy day by day. But after the expedition, most of these watches quietly disappeared, lost, forgotten, and scattered across time. For decades, they were thought to be gone. Then, 60 years later, Major Desmond Roy Homard, a former member of the expedition, opened a kitchen drawer and found his. He later donated the watch to Tudor's archives, one of the very few known survivors of the entire expedition. And while those watches quietly proved themselves in the Arctic, something even bigger was about to happen. In 1953, a small group of climbers set out to reach the highest point on Earth. Among them was Edmund Hillary, wearing a Rolex. When he reached the summit of Mount Everest, the world would never look at wristwatches the same way again. Because from that moment on, a watch wasn't just a tool, it was proof that it could survive where humans barely could. And this was only the beginning. In Part 2, we'll dive into how Rolex turned these extreme moments into one of the most powerful brand stories in history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for Part 2. And let me know in the comments, would you trust your watch in these conditions? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.